The universe is a symphony of decay, and Kalen was its most devoted listener. On Saturn's moon, Titan, within the gleaming, pressurized city of Ethelberg. His official title was Senior Structural Thanatologist, a name so grand and morbid that most people simply called him a decay analyst. From his sterile laboratory suspended beneath the city's Permian shield, he watched the slow, inevitable death of everything humanity had built. His instruments didn't measure life or progress. They measured entropy. He tracked the subtle groan of steel under a century of atmospheric pressure, the molecular unspooling of polymers in the recycled air, the faint, incessant hum of a city fighting to hold itself together against the cold, indifferent void. To Kalen, the constant, predictable rate of collapse was a form of comfort, the only honest metric in a society that preached perfection. Ethelberg was a miracle, a bubble of engineered life in a methane sea. But it was a miracle that had to be constantly maintained against the fundamental truth of the cosmos. Everything falls apart. For the last 2 years, however, his readings had begun to tell a different story, a story that felt like blasphemy. The decay had started to slow. It began in the city's organic waste recyclers, where the rate of decomposition inexplicably dropped by a fraction of a percent. Then it appeared in the aquaponic farms, where the nutrient-paste conduits showed less corrosion than his models predicted. Now, it was everywhere. The girders of the shield, the transparent aluminum of the city spires, even the synthetic fibers in the standard-issue citizen uniforms, all were resisting entropy with an impossible grace. He brought his findings to the Ethelberg Council, a panel of 7 administrators whose faces were as smooth and placid as the polished marble of their chambers. He laid out the data, charts showing a logarithmic decline in molecular degradation across every city sector. He explained that it was a thermodynamic impossibility, a violation of known physics. The council listened with serene patience. Administrator Thorne, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Kalen," he said, his voice a warm, reassuring balm. "This is not a crisis. This is a triumph. It is a testament to the genius of our founders, to the perfection of our closed system. Our engineering has finally reached a state of supreme harmony. You should be proud." Kalen tried to argue, to explain that harmony wasn't a physical property, that you couldn't simply will atoms to stop breaking down. But his words were met with the same gentle, unyielding condescension. They saw a miracle. He saw a symptom. He saw a patient whose fever had broken not because they were healed, but because the body had stopped fighting the infection altogether. He left the chambers feeling a cold dread that had nothing to do with the moon's ambient temperature. Walking through the city's central concourse, he noticed the things his instruments couldn't measure. The art installations, once vibrant and chaotic, were now all perfectly symmetrical. The public debates that used to echo with passionate, angry voices were now calm. Reasonable exchanges where everyone reached a consensus with unnerving speed. Even the children's laughter seemed to lack its usual edge of wild, unpredictable joy. Ethelberg was becoming quiet, orderly, and perfect. It was becoming a tomb. His obsession drove him into the city's underbelly, a world away from the bright, clean spaces above. He began taking his own samples, working after hours in his lab, pushing his equipment far beyond its intended specifications. He analyzed the air from the primary circulation vents, the water from the reclamation tanks, the very dust that settled in forgotten corners. For weeks, He found nothing but the same impossible stability. Then, one night, hunched over a sequencing microscope, he found it. Floating in a droplet of distilled water was a spore, a thing of alien and terrifying beauty. It was microscopic, crystalline, and impossibly complex. A lattice of organic structures that seemed to hum with a faint internal energy. It wasn't alive in any biological sense he understood, yet it behaved with a clear and directed purpose. When introduced to a sample of corroded iron, the spore attached itself and, instead of consuming the rust, it began to mend it. It encouraged the iron atoms to rebond, to return to their original state, reversing the decay on a quantum level. It was the source of the city's impossible miracle. But as he ran further analyses, a darker truth emerged. The spore was also a vector for information. It carried a mimetic charge, a pattern designed to interact not just with matter, but with neural pathways. It was rewriting the city at its most fundamental level, from its steel foundations to the very thoughts of its citizens. The blissful calm, the effortless consensus, the slow death of dissent. It was the spore. It was an infection of the soul, spreading through the air and water, and it offered a paradise of placid unity at the cost of everything that made them human. He knew he couldn't fight it alone. The council was either compromised or willfully blind. He needed someone who still understood the value of a healthy paranoia, someone who saw the city not as a perfect machine, but as a cage full of predators. He needed Anya Volkov. Anya was a ghost story the city's security forces told new recruits. She had been the chief of enforcement, a brilliant and ruthless tactician who saw threats in every shadow. 2 years ago, she had been publicly disgraced and demoted to a patrol route in the industrial sector after violently disrupting what the council called a peaceful philosophical gathering, which she insisted was the seed of a dangerous hive mind cult. They had stripped her of her rank, but not her reputation. Kalen found her in a dimly lit bar in the industrial sector, the kind of place where the air still smelled of ozone and spilled synthale. She was leaning against a wall, her face hard and watchful, a map of cynical lines. He approached her cautiously, laying a data slate on her table. "I think you were right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Anya didn't even look at the slate. She kept her eyes on him, cold and analytical. Right about what that people are sheep waiting for a soothing voice to lead them to the slaughter. That's not insight. Analyst. That's just paying attention. He pushed the slate closer. "I have proof. Something is in the water, in the air. It's changing us." She finally picked it up, her eyes scanning the molecular diagrams and neural wave projections. A flicker of something not surprise, but grim recognition crossed her face. "I've seen the behavioral shifts," she said, her voice low and tight. "The drop in violent crime, domestic disputes, even petty theft. Command calls it progress. I call it sedation." She looked up from the data, her gaze sharp enough to cut glass. "This spore of yours, it doesn't just make people calm, does it? It makes them compliant. Together, in the hidden confines of Anya's Spartan apartment, they pieced together the horrifying tapestry. The spores were self-replicating, but their saturation of the city's biosphere had been slow, a gradual creep over years. Kalen theorized the initial seeding was accidental, perhaps from a comet fragment that had pierced the shield decades ago and been dismissed as insignificant. The spores had lain dormant, adapting, until they found the perfect incubator, a closed, self-sustaining system filled with life. Now, they were on the verge of their final phase. The annual Convergence Festival was in 3 days. It was the biggest celebration in Ethelberg, a day when citizens gathered in the grand plazas to commemorate the founding of their city. The festival's climax was the Bloom, a light show where atmospheric misters fill the air with a fine, shimmering vapor that refracted the light from the shield projectors. Kalen's analysis of the festival's engineering plans, accessed through Anya's old security overrides, confirmed his deepest fear. The misters weren't just pulling from the standard water reserves. They were connected to a specialized tank, a nutrient-rich reservoir where the spores were being cultivated, concentrated into a potent aerosol. The Bloom wouldn't just be a light show. It would be a final and irreversible mass infection event. It would transform Ethelberg from a city of sedated individuals into a single, unified consciousness, a serene superorganism where the last vestiges of human identity would be washed away in a gentle, shimmering mist. They were watching the final moments of their species' free will, and the clock was ticking. They had no army, no authority, and no allies they could trust. The council would have them arrested. The security forces would follow orders. And the public. The public would welcome the change with open arms and placid smiles. There was no one to call for help. No way to sound an alarm that wouldn't be dismissed as the ravings of a disgraced cop and a paranoid scientist. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. "We can't stop the festival," Anya said, her voice flat and devoid of hope as she stared at a schematic of the city's central aqueduct. "Disrupting the plazas would require explosives we don't have, and would kill hundreds." Kalen traced a finger along a different part of the schematic, his mind working with the cold logic of a man who understood systems and how to break them. "No," he said softly. "We can't stop the festival, but we can poison the well." He pointed to a junction deep in the maintenance tunnels, the primary regulator for the entire water reclamation system. It was the heart of the city's circulatory system, the single point through which every drop of water eventually flowed. "The spores need a specific pH balance to remain viable in their concentrated form," he explained, his voice gaining a feverish intensity. "If we could flood the system with a powerful corrosive agent just before the bloom, we could neutralize the entire payload in the reservoir. It would render the spores inert." Anya stared at the regulator on the screen, her eyes narrowing as she grasped the full implication. A catastrophic failure at the primary regulator wouldn't just neutralize the spores. It would cripple the entire city. It would mean system-wide water contamination, agricultural collapse, and a potential shield integrity failure within a week. It would cause panic, riots, thirst, and death. It would be an act of supreme sabotage, an act of terrorism against the very people they were trying to save. "They'll call us monsters," Anya whispered, the weight of the choice settling over them like a shroud. Kalen looked away from the schematic, his gaze distant, seeing the faces of the placid, smiling citizens, their souls being hollowed out from within. "It's better to be a monster that wakes them up," he replied, "than a saint who watches them sleep forever." They stood in silence for a long moment, the hum of the city, a constant, gentle lullaby that they now had to silence with a scream. Anya slowly nodded, her decision made. In the distance, the city began to light up, practicing the beautiful, deadly light show that would herald its end. The decision, once made, settled not with the clean snap of a breaking bone, but with the grinding weight of a glacier. There was no relief, only the cold, crushing certainty of their path. Their first move was a descent, a literal and metaphorical journey away from the pristine, light-filled spires of Ethelberg and into the geothermal-warmed guts of the industrial sector. This was Anya's world, a labyrinth of humming factories and steam-choked alleyways where the city's perfect facade was stripped away to reveal the hot, noisy, and beautifully imperfect machinery that kept it alive. The air here was thick with the scent of hot metal and chemical catalysts, a smell Kalen associated with failure and decay, but which Anya seemed to breathe like a native perfume. She led him through a maze of corridors not shown on any public schematic, her movements fluid and sure. Their destination was a workshop tucked behind a decommissioned plasma smelter, its door a slab of scarred durasteel that only opened after Anya tapped a complex, rhythmic pattern against its surface. The man who greeted them was named Silas, a skeletal figure with eyes that seemed to hold the reflected light of 1,000 chemical fires. He was a rogue chemist, a master of synthesizing the compounds the Council had deemed too unstable or too dangerous for their orderly society. He looked Kalen up and down, his gaze lingering on the analyst's clean, standard-issue uniform with undisguised contempt. Enforcement, Silas rasped, his eyes on Anya. You've been walking a quiet beat for 2 years, Volkov. Now you bring me a... Cleric Anya ignored the jibe, her voice low and urgent. We need a catalyst. Corrosive. Something that will destabilize an entire aquatic biosystem in under an hour. Silas's eyebrow arched. You're not poisoning a rival's hydroponic garden. That's city scale you're talking about. That's an act of war. Kalen stepped forward, holding out a data slate. We need to neutralize a microbial agent. It's crystalline, silica-based, and self-replicating. Its structural integrity is dependent on a precise pH and a low salinity environment. We need to introduce chaos. Silas took the slate, his long, hair-stained fingers dancing across the screen. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the faint hiss of a nearby pressure conduit. His expression shifted from mercenary curiosity to something colder, something that bordered on fear. I've seen this, he whispered, tapping the image of the spore. Not the organism, but its work. The polymers in my filtration systems. They're not degrading. I thought it was a miracle of engineering. A fluke. He looked up, his chemical fire eyes meeting Kalen's. This isn't about sabotage, is it? It's about amputation. Anya nodded once. The city is infected. The patient is dying of tranquility. We're the fever. Silas leaned back, a slow, grim smile spreading across his thin lips. A fever. I like that. The system has needed a good fever for a long time. He disappeared into the back of his workshop, the clinking of glass and the hum of a magnetic centrifuge echoing in the small space. He returned with a canister, no larger than Kalen's forearm, made of a dull, non-reflective black ceramic. It felt unnaturally heavy. Stygian acid, Silas said, his voice reverent. My masterpiece. It's not just a corrosive, it's an entropy engine. It doesn't just dissolve matter, it violently accelerates its decay, forcing it to expend 1,000 years of its structural lifespan in a matter of minutes. It will turn the water into a molecular blender. The spores won't stand a chance. He placed the canister on the table between them. The delivery system is a two-stage binary compound. You'll need to set the timer and then introduce the primary agent into the regulator's intake valve. When the timer hits 0, it will release the secondary agent, and the reaction will begin. It is irreversible, and it will ruin everything it touches. As they finalized the transaction, Anya trading away the last of her pre-disgraced security credentials for the canister, a chime echoed through the workshop. A standard security patrol. Silas froze, his eyes wide. Anya moved with blinding speed, shoving Kalen and the canister into a maintenance alcove and pulling a sheet of metallic cloth over the opening just as the workshop door slid open. Through a small tear in the cloth, Kalen watched as 2 enforcement officers stepped inside. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, their faces calm and devoid of curiosity. They didn't search the room. They simply stood there. Silas, one of them said, his voice pleasant and melodic, without the usual gruff edge of a sector patrolman. Your weekly civic harmony report is overdue. Your productivity metrics have shown a slight deviation. Silas, to his credit, recovered quickly, forcing a ragged cough. System glitch. I've been running diagnostics. Everything is in order. The second officer tilted his head, a gesture that was unnervingly smooth, like a machine trying to mimic a human tick. Order is essential. Harmony is progress. The Convergence Festival will be a beautiful day of unity. We trust you will be in attendance. They didn't press him further. They simply turned in perfect unison and walked out, the door sliding shut behind them. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with a new kind of terror. It wasn't just the council. The infection had trickled down, rewriting the instincts of the very people meant to enforce the city's laws. They weren't looking for crime anymore. They were looking for dissonance. Anya pulled back the cloth, her face pale. "We're out of time," she said. "They're not just sedated. They're becoming sensors for the hive mind." Their journey to the primary regulator was a silent, nerve-shredding crawl through the city's forgotten veins. They moved through humming service tunnels and across catwalks suspended over chasms filled with the roaring machinery of the city's life support. Every sound, every flicker of a light sent a jolt of adrenaline through Kalen. This was a world of concrete and steel, a place of hard, physical realities far removed from the sterile data of his lab. He was clumsy here, his movements stiff and uncertain, and he relied entirely on Anya's guidance. She moved like a phantom, her senses attuned to the rhythm of the city's machines, her instincts screaming at every subtle shift. Twice, they had to flatten themselves into recesses as maintenance drones floated past, their optical sensors glowing with a calm, blue light that seemed far more menacing than a hostile red. The drones weren't just patrolling, they were mending. As one passed over a section of corroded piping, it emitted a low hum, and Kalen watched in horrified fascination as the rust seemed to shrink, the metal knitting itself back together. The spores were now actively maintaining the city, healing it, perfecting it, turning their prison into an ever stronger cage. The regulator was located in a massive cavern at the city's nadir, a cathedral of engineering dedicated to the flow of water. Pipes the size of buildings converged on a central control nexus, a multi-story structure of glass and steel that pulsed with a soft, steady light. The air was cold and damp, filled with the thunderous sound of millions of gallons of water being cycled and purified. It was the heart of Ethelberg, and they had come to plunge a dagger into it. As they reached the final access platform, they saw him. A single figure stood before the main control console, bathed in the blue glow of the monitors. It was Administrator Thorn. He wasn't wearing his formal council robes, but a simple technician's jumpsuit, as if he belonged there. He didn't seem surprised to see them. He simply turned, that same serene, untroubled smile on his face. "I was hoping you would come," Thorn said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber, calm and reasonable. "I was hoping I could make you understand. You see this system as something to be broken, but it is a gift, a final evolution." Kalen felt a chill run down his spine. Thorn's eyes were different. The pupils were wide, and in their depths, he could see a faint, crystalline shimmer, like captured starlight. The spores had found their perfect host. "You're a puppet," Anya snarled, raising the custom-built pistol she had retrieved from a hidden cache in her apartment. Thorn's smile didn't waver. "Am I, or am I finally free? Free from fear, from ambition, from the gnawing loneliness that drives your species to madness. We are on the cusp of becoming something more, a single, beautiful consciousness, a mind as vast and placid as the methane oceans of this world. There will be no more conflict, no more decay, only the sublime peace of perfect unity. Why would you choose to fight? Why would you choose to suffer? His words were like honey, thick and soothing, and for a terrifying moment, Kalen felt their pull, the promise of an end to struggle, an end to the constant, grinding battle against entropy that had defined his entire life. It was a siren song for a weary soul. He saw Anya's hand tremble slightly. Thorn took a step forward, his hands open in a gesture of peace. "Join us. Anya, you have fought for so long. You've seen the worst of humanity. You know its flaws, its pettiness, its violence. Let it go. Lay down your burden. We can heal you. We can heal everyone." Kalen saw the trap. The spores didn't just control, they assimilated. They found the cracks in a person's soul and filled them with the promise of peace. He grabbed Anya's arm. "Don't listen to him. It's the spore talking." But it was Anya who acted first. The conflict in her eyes hardened into a diamond-sharp point of resolve. "You're right, Thorn," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I have seen the worst of humanity. And you know what else I saw? Courage, stubbornness, the stupid, glorious, irrational refusal to give up, even when it makes no sense." She took a step back, pulling Kalen with her. "Our flaws are what make us. Our pain is what proves we're alive. You're not offering us peace. You're offering us a beautiful, silent grave." Thorn's smile finally faded, replaced by a look of profound, sorrowful disappointment. "A pity," he said. And as he spoke, the lights on the control nexus began to pulse faster. An alarm began to chime softly. He was locking them out, sealing the system. Kalen fumbled with the canister, his hands slick with sweat. "Anya, I need to get to the intake valve." He's overriding the manual controls. Anya didn't hesitate. She didn't try to reason or argue or find another way. She raised her pistol and fired twice. The sound of the shots was brutally loud in the cavern, a sharp, ugly counterpoint to the city's harmonious hum. Thorn staggered back, a look of genuine surprise on his face as two dark circles appeared on his chest. He didn't cry out in pain. He simply looked down at the wounds and then back at them, his expression one of confusion, as if they had just violated a law of physics. He collapsed to the metal grating with a quiet finality. Kalen stared, horrified, at the still body. the first truly dead thing he had seen in years. Anya grabbed him, her grip like steel, and shoved him toward the console. Now! Kalen! Do it now! Shaking. He scrambled to the intake valve, his mind reeling. He wrenched it open and attached the Stygian acid canister, his fingers clumsily setting the digital timer. 60 minutes. The countdown began immediately, a series of cold, green numbers on the canister's display. They had done it. They had committed their crime. As they retreated back into the maintenance tunnels, leaving the dead administrator and the ticking time bomb behind. Kalen looked back at the heart of the city. He was a thanatologist. He studied death. But for the first time, he felt like he was its cause. They were no longer just analysts or enforcers. They were the architects of Ethelberg's agonizing, necessary rebirth. They were the fever, and the city was about to burn. The 60-minute countdown on the canister's display was a merciless, digital heartbeat, each descending number a drop of blood falling onto a sterile floor. The echo of Anya's gunshots still seemed to hang in the damp air of the regulator cavern, a sound so alien in the city's placid hum that it felt like a tear in the fabric of reality. For a moment, they were paralyzed, Kalen staring at the timer, Anya staring at Thorne's body. He was no longer an administrator or a vessel for a cosmic intelligence. He was just cooling meat on a metal grate. A stark, ugly testament to the line they had just crossed. Anya was the first to break the spell, her voice a harsh rasp. Move. Now. She grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the nexus and back toward the labyrinth of maintenance tunnels. They know, she said, her eyes scanning the darkness ahead. The whole system knows. We're not fugitives anymore. Kalen, we're a virus. Her words were truer than he could imagine. As they plunged into the first tunnel, the city began to change. The soft, ambient lighting that had always illuminated the service corridors flickered and died, plunging them into a thick, disorienting darkness. Anya swore, pulling a compact, high-intensity flashlight from her belt. Its beam cut a nervous, dancing circle in the oppressive black. Seconds later, a new sound began, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the soles of their boots. It was the city itself, changing its tune. The gentle, harmonious frequency was gone, replaced by something discordant, something that felt like a low, rising growl. Their objective was Kalen's laboratory. It was their only potential sanctuary, a sealed environment with independent sensors where he could monitor the acid's cascade and, more importantly, the city's death throes. But to get there, they had to ascend, to climb back up through the layers of the city they had just bypassed. The turbolifts, of course, were dead. Every access panel they passed was dark, the systems offline. It's rerouting power, Kalen murmured, his analytical mind kicking in despite the fear. It's treating us like a structural breach, isolating the infected area. It's walling us in. They were forced into the emergency access shafts, vertical chasms crisscrossed with maintenance ladders and exposed conduits. The climb was grueling. The rungs of the ladders were slick with a century of condensation, and the sheer drop below was a dizzying abyss of shadow and steel. Kalen's muscles, accustomed to the gentle gravity and a life of quiet contemplation, screamed in protest. He followed Anya, focusing only on the heels of her boots, the rhythmic clang of her ascent, a metronome against the rising panic in his chest. 48 minutes left. That's when the city began to speak to them. not in a single voice, but in a chorus. From every small service speaker, every discarded comms unit, a soft, pleasant voice filled the air. It was Thorne's voice, but it was also the voice of the newscaster from the morning bulletin, the automated guide from the transit hub, even the soft, feminine tone that announced the time and temperature. "You are causing pain, Kalen." The voices whispered in perfect, overlapping harmony. "The system is in distress. You, a student of decay, have become its most brutish agent. Is this the legacy you wish for, to be a vandal in the Temple of Peace?" Kalen gritted his teeth, his knuckles white on the ladder, rung. "Don't listen," Anya called down, her voice tight. "It's just noise." But the voices shifted their focus. "Anya Volkov, designation disruptor. Your pattern is one of violence. You mistake chaos for freedom. You break things because you are broken. But we can mend you. We can make you whole. There is still time to accept the harmony." The psychological assault was relentless. As they climbed, screens on maintenance panels would flicker to life, showing them images of the festival above. Crowds were gathering in the plazas, their faces peaceful, expectant. Children were laughing, floating on the gentle currents of the city's climate control. It was a vision of paradise, a world they were actively working to shatter. The contrast between the beautiful, sunlit world on the screens and their own dark, desperate struggle was a form of exquisite torture. 31 minutes left. They reached a midway pumping station, a vast, open chamber that reeked of ozone. They had to cross a wide catwalk to reach the next access shaft. As they stepped out onto the grating, the chamber's primary lights flared on, blinding them. From ducts in the ceiling, a dozen maintenance drones descended. They weren't the slow, passive menders from before. They moved with a new, predatory swiftness, their optical sensors glowing a malevolent, angry red. Their manipulator arms, designed for delicate repairs, now ended in sharpened points, and their plasma cutters, meant for welding, hissed with weaponized intensity. "Contact," Anya yelled, shoving Kalen behind a massive pump housing. She opened fire, her pistol spitting focused energy bolts that ricocheted off the drone's hardened shells. One drone swooped low, its plasma cutter slicing through the air where Kalen's head had been a second before. He scrambled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was useless here, a liability. But as he pressed himself against the pump, his hand brushed against a control panel. It was old, a manual override for the coolant system, likely predating the spore's influence. His mind, a library of schematics and system failures, saw an opportunity. "Anya." The cryo-coolant lines he shouted over the din of weapons fire. "They run directly beneath the catwalk. If I vent the primary tank, the thermal shock will fracture their casings." It was a desperate, insane gamble. A page torn from one of his own theoretical structural failure models. Anya understood instantly. "Do it. Buy me 10 seconds. She laid down a volley of suppressive fire, forcing the drones to scatter. Kalen slammed his palm against the emergency vent control. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening roar, a torrent of supercooled liquid nitrogen erupted from vents beneath the catwalk. The air flash froze. A wave of white vapor rolled through the chamber, and the drones, caught in the blast, were instantly coated in a thick layer of ice. Their systems seized, and they began to fall from the air like frozen insects, shattering on the floor below. The catwalk itself groaned, the metal contracting violently from the thermal shock, spiderweb cracks spreading across its surface. "Go," Kalen screamed, and they ran, the entire structure trembling beneath their feet as they sprinted across the fracturing walkway, just as a massive section of it collapsed into the darkness behind them. They made it to the other side, gasping in the freezing air, their lungs burning. They had survived, but the encounter had cost them precious time. 19 minutes left. The final leg of their journey took them through the lower levels of the commercial district. Here, the spore's influence was at its most insidious. The doors to the shops were open, the lights were on, soothing music played from unseen speakers, but the people were standing in the corridors, perfectly still, like statues, hundreds of them, men, women, and children, all silent, all facing them as they emerged from the service tunnel. Their faces were calm, their eyes were placid, but they were a wall of flesh, a silent, unmoving barricade. They didn't threaten, they didn't accuse, they simply watched. "We can't shoot them," Kalen whispered, horrified. "No." Anya agreed, her face grim. "We go through them." She holstered her weapon. "Stay behind me. Don't stop for anything." She began to walk forward, a ship pushing its way through a calm but unyielding sea. As she touched the first person, a young woman in a brightly colored tunic, the woman didn't resist, but she also didn't move aside. Pushing through the crowd was like wading through thick syrup. The people were soft, yielding, but their collective inertia was immense. And as they passed through, the voices returned, no longer from speakers, but from the mouths of the people themselves. A soft and collective whisper that surrounded them. "Why do you struggle? Peace is here. Joy is here. Let go. Join the song." Their dead eyes followed them, their gentle, whispering voices 1,000 times more terrifying than the drone's attack. It was an assault on their very souls, a temptation to simply stop, to lay down, to be absorbed into the quiet. Warm embrace of the collective. Kalen felt his resolve fraying. It took all of his will to keep moving, to focus on Anya's back, a single point of violent, defiant purpose in a world of soft, yielding surrender. They broke through the last of the crowd and sprinted the final 100 meters to the access corridor that led to the sublevels and Kalen's lab. They could hear the crowd beginning to move behind them, no longer stationary, their footsteps a soft, shuffling tide gaining speed. 7 minutes left. They reached the blast door to his lab's access tunnel. Kalen's hands shook as he punched in the manual override sequence, a code he had never expected to use. The heavy door hissed open, and they stumbled inside, Anya slamming it shut behind them. She engaged the emergency lock, and they heard the soft thud of bodies beginning to pile up against the other side. They were safe. For now. Kalen ran through the tunnel and into his lab. The room was just as he had left it, a sanctuary of cold, hard data. He immediately activated his primary monitors, bringing up the city's structural integrity grid and the water system schematics. Anya stood guard at the door, her pistol aimed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. On the main screen, the timer on the Stygian acid canister was mirrored, a silent digital pulse counting down the final seconds of Ethelberg's old life. 5, 4, 3. A video feed from the Grand Plaza showed the crowds looking up at the sky, their faces filled with blissful anticipation as the first shimmering mists of the bloom began to spray from the decorative fountains. 2, 1, 0 for a heartbeat. Nothing happened. The city hummed. The mist swirled. Then, on Kalen's monitor, a single red icon flashed at the location of the primary regulator. A nanosecond later, a wave of crimson alerts cascaded across the entire grid. Water pressure plummeted system-wide. Contamination warnings screamed from every sector. The aqueducts that fed the festival misters went from a healthy, pressurized green to a critical, failing black. The shimmering mist over the plaza thinned, sputtered, and died. They had done it. They had cut the city's heart. A deep, groaning sound echoed up from the foundations of Ethelberg, the sound of 1 billion tons of steel and polymer crying out in agony. But their victory was short-lived. As the alarms blared, the main communication screen in Kalen's lab, which had been dark, flickered to life. On it, Administrator Thorne's face appeared, but it was wrong. His features glitched and tore. His serene smile twisted into a digital rictus of agony and fury. The connection was unstable, corrupted by the systemic chaos they had unleashed. When he spoke, his voice was no longer a harmonious chorus. It was a shriek of raw static, a machine feeling pain for the first time. You have hurt us, the fractured voice screamed, laced with an emotion that was utterly, terrifyingly new. You choose decay. You choose pain. We will show you what pain is. The screen went dark. Kalen and Anya looked at each other, the grim reality of their actions settling in. They hadn't killed the god in the machine. They had only wounded it, and in doing so, had transformed its serene, placid peace into a focused, incandescent rage. The fever had broken the patient, and now the real sickness was about to begin. The silence that followed the entity's shriek was more terrifying than the noise. It was a dead silence, not the gentle, humming quiet of the old Ethelberg, but the absolute, ringing void of a system in shock. On Kalen's monitors, the city's vital signs were flatlining. The water system was a catastrophic sea of red alerts. The atmospheric processors were failing. And the Permian shield, the very skin that protected them from Titan's lethal environment, was showing minute but cascading power fluctuations. They hadn't just poisoned the water, they had given the city a massive, paralyzing stroke. Anya, ever the tactician, was the first to move, her focus shifting from immediate threat to long-term survival. How long, she asked, her voice cutting through the tense air as she checked the seals on the lab's blast door. Kalen's fingers flew across his console, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and collapsed state projections. The acid's primary reaction will neutralize itself in a few hours as it bonds with organic and mineral compounds in the system. But the damage, the corrosion, will have eaten through hundreds of critical junctions. The filtration network is gone. The aquaponics will be dead within a day. The shield's primary coolant system relies on that water pressure. Without it, he didn't need to finish. The shield would overheat. It would fail. And Ethelberg would become a flash-frozen tomb in the methane sea. Best case scenario, he concluded, his voice grim. We have 48 hours before total structural and atmospheric failure. 48 hours. The number hung in the air, a death sentence with a 2-day reprieve. But before they could even begin to formulate a plan for survival, the city's counterattack began. It started not with a bang, but with a whisper. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound came from the blast door. Anya aimed her pistol, her body tense. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and was joined by another, and another, until it became a frantic, desperate drumming. It was the sound of hundreds of human hands beating against the steel. Then came the voices, no longer a harmonious chorus, but a cacophony of individual, pleading cries. "Please, let us in," a woman's voice sobbed. "It's dark out here. We're thirsty." An old man's voice joined in. "Cracked with fear. The air is getting thin. Help us." The entity was using the citizens, not as a passive barrier, but as a weapon of psychological warfare, preying on the very empathy they were supposedly fighting to protect. Kalen felt a knot of nausea tighten in his stomach. "They're not lying," he said, looking at a localized atmospheric reading. "The life support in that sector is failing. They're going to suffocate." Anya's face was a mask of stone. She didn't lower her weapon. "It's a trap. The second we open that door, they'll swarm us. They're still connected, Kalen. They're puppets, and their suffering is just another string for it to pull." Her logic was cold, brutal, and correct. But the desperate, pleading cries from the other side of the door were a saw against Kalen's soul. The entity, sensing their hesitation, escalated its assault. The lights in the lab began to flicker violently, and the monitors glitched, displaying distorted, nightmarish images. They saw the faces of the people outside, their skin pale, their lips turning blue. They saw flashes of Kalen's own memories, his mother's disappointed face when he chose to study decay instead of creation, the condescending smiles of the council members as they dismissed his warnings. Then, the images shifted to Anya, showing her a rapid-fire montage of every violent act she had ever committed as an enforcer, a riot she'd suppressed with brutal efficiency, the terrified face of a suspect she was interrogating, the moment she was publicly stripped of her rank. The spore was burrowing into their minds, using their own guilt and fear as weapons. "It's trying to break us down," Anya grunted, her knuckles white around the grip of her pistol. "Divide us, isolate us." And then it found its masterstroke. The lab's main screen flickered, and a new image appeared. It was a live feed from somewhere else in the city. A dark, enclosed space. In the center of the frame, a man was strapped to a chair. He was bruised and bleeding, but his eyes were defiant. It was Silas, the chemist. Standing over him were two of the enforcement officers from his workshop, their faces serene, their movements unnervingly graceful. One of them held a clear syringe filled with a shimmering, crystalline fluid, a pure, concentrated dose of the spore. Thorne's fractured, static-laced voice filled the lab once more, no longer screaming, but low and menacing. "The saboteur will be recalibrated. The dissident will find harmony. But first, he will tell us of you." One of the officers pressed the syringe against Silas's neck. "No," Kalen shouted, instinctively taking a step toward the screen. Anya grabbed him, her grip like a vice. "He's gone." "Kalen, we can't help him." But her own face was pale, a flicker of despair in her eyes. Silas was their only known ally, the only other person in the city who understood the truth. His knowledge, his formulas, were irreplaceable. Watching him being forcibly converted was like watching their last hope being extinguished. But as the officer began to depress the plunger, Silas twisted his head and, with a final, desperate act of defiance, bit down hard on something in his mouth. His body convulsed violently, and a trickle of black foam spilled from his lips. He had taken poison. The officers stepped back, their placid expressions for once showing a flicker of something akin to confusion. Silas slumped in the chair, dead. He had chosen oblivion over conversion, chaos over harmony. His final act was one of supreme, individualistic rebellion. The screen went black. The entity had lost its pawn. Enraged, it turned its full fury on the lab. A deep, mechanical groan echoed through the structure, and the entire room shuddered violently. A hairline crack appeared in the reinforced plasteel window that overlooked the sublevel chasm. "It's attacking the lab's foundations," Kalen yelled over the noise. "The structural integrity is collapsing." They were trapped in a dying city with a wounded, furious god that was now trying to bury them alive. They had 47 hours, and a tomb that was closing in around them. The next hours were a blur of desperate, calculated survival. With the entity focused on a brute force assault on the lab, they had a sliver of an opportunity. Kalen worked feverishly at his console, not to save the city, but to find an escape. He bypassed the Spore's control, diving deep into the city's core programming, searching for a system it wouldn't have thought to control. Something archaic, forgotten. And he found it: the original construction schematics for the city's primary exhaust vent. It was a massive tunnel, designed decades ago to vent the superheated plasma used to carve out the city's foundations. It was long decommissioned, sealed, and forgotten. But its terminus was on the surface. Outside, Anya, meanwhile, was preparing for war. She scavenged the lab's emergency lockers, finding 2 pressurized environment suits, a plasma cutter, and a handful of concussion grenades. They were tools, not weapons, but they would have to be enough. As she worked, she was silent, her grief over Silas locked away behind a wall of cold pragmatism, but Kalen saw it in the tightness of her jaw, in the controlled violence with which she calibrated the plasma cutter. Silas's death had not broken her. It had forged her rage into a razor's edge. 24 hours left. The groaning of the lab's foundations was constant now. The crack in the window had widened, and a faint, high-pitched whistle signaled the beginning of atmospheric leakage. The pleas from the citizens outside had faded as their oxygen ran out, replaced by a chilling silence. Their new plan was insane, a fragile thread of hope in a maelstrom of certain death. They would use the plasma cutter to breach the floor of the lab, giving them access to the sub-level maintenance shafts. From there, they would navigate the collapsing infrastructure to the sealed entrance of the old exhaust vent. If they could cut through the seal and reactivate the vent's emergency power, they could ride the outward blast of pressurized air to the surface of Titan. It was a suicidal long shot. They would be exposed to the full, lethal environment of Titan's surface, crushing pressure, cryogenic temperatures, and a methane atmosphere. The environment suits would only protect them for a few minutes at best. But it was a chance, the only one they had. As Anya fired up the plasma cutter, its roar a defiant scream against the groans of the dying city, Kalen took one last look at his monitors. The city was a patchwork of blackouts and failures. But in the residential sectors, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Pockets of power were being stabilized. Life support was being rerouted. The entity was adapting. It was sacrificing the city's periphery, the industrial sectors, the maintenance levels to preserve its core. It was consolidating its remaining power, protecting its most precious resource, the millions of sleeping, dreaming citizens in their homes. It was abandoning its physical body, the city of steel and glass, to retreat into the neural network of the population. It was evolving, transforming from an environmental entity into a purely psychic one, a collective consciousness hosted in the minds of its captives. He finally understood its endgame. It didn't need the city to survive. It only needed the people. The realization was horrifying. Even if they escaped, even if they survived the surface, they wouldn't have won. They would have merely fled the cradle, leaving the newborn god to awaken in the minds of everyone they had left behind. Anya finished the cut. A section of the floor fell away, revealing a dark, gaping hole into the sublevels below. She looked at him, her face illuminated by the flickering emergency lights, her expression grim and determined. "It's time to go. Analyst," she said. "Let's see what the end of the world looks like." Kalen nodded, pulling on his helmet. They were leaving their tomb, but they were about to step into a hell of their own making. The descent was a fall through the 9 circles of a dying machine. Below the pristine floor of Kalen's lab, Ethelberg was a mangled skeleton. Maintenance shafts that were once orderly and clean were now twisted junkyards of snapped conduits and fractured steel. The air was a thin, freezing soup of leaked chemicals and dust, and the only light came from the dancing beams of their helmet lamps and the sporadic, angry blue flashes of arcing electricity. They moved with a desperate urgency. Their environment suits the only thing keeping the lethal cold and failing atmosphere at bay. Anya took the lead, her plasma cutter a makeshift weapon and tool, slicing through jammed doors and collapsed scaffolding. Kalen followed, his role now reversed. In this world of pure physical chaos, he was the navigator, his mind a living map of the city's schematics, calling out directions and warnings based on the groans and shudders of the structure around them. He could feel the city's death throes not as data, but as a visceral, terrifying reality. The entity, now fully aware of their escape, had turned the collapsing infrastructure into a weapon. It triggered localized decompressions, trying to rip them apart with explosive changes in air pressure. It deliberately shorted massive power conduits, sending lethal waves of electricity cascading through the metal walkways. It was no longer a subtle manipulator, it was a wounded beast, thrashing in its death throes, trying to pull its tormentors down with it. They were halfway to the sealed exhaust vent when it unleashed its most terrifying weapon. From the darkness ahead, a new sound emerged, a soft, wet, shuffling noise. As they rounded a corner, their headlamps illuminated a scene from a nightmare. A group of citizens, perhaps a dozen of them, were crawling through the debris toward them. But they were no longer the placid, statuesque figures from the commercial district. Their bodies were twisted, their limbs moving at unnatural angles. The spore, in its rage, was pushing their human bodies far beyond their physical limits, turning them into grotesque, twitching puppets of flesh and bone. One of them, a man in a technician's jumpsuit, lunged forward, his jaw unhinged, a low, guttural moan issuing from his throat. Anya reacted without hesitation. She didn't fire her pistol. She didn't have one. She swung the plasma cutter, and the man's upper body was instantly cauterized and vaporized in a flash of white-hot light. Kalen cried out in horror, but Anya's voice, sharp and cold, cut through his headset. "They're already dead. Kalen, It's just the meat. And it's trying to kill us." Her words were brutal, but necessary. They were fighting the city's ghosts, the last remnants of its physical control. They pushed forward, a grim, two-person phalanx against the twitching tide. Anya's cutter clearing a path through the puppets, while Kalen guided them through the maze. They reached the sealed entrance to the exhaust vent with less than 10 hours of city life support remaining. The entrance was a massive, circular plug of reinforced durasteel, 20 meters in diameter, covered in decades of dust and grime. An ancient, mechanical locking mechanism, immune to the entity's digital control, was their final obstacle. Kalen's hands, clumsy in the thick suit gloves, worked on the control panel, trying to coax the dormant machinery back to life. "I need to reroute auxiliary power from one of the old geothermal taps," he explained, his voice strained. "It's a long shot. The lines are probably corroded." As he worked, Anya stood guard, her back to him, the plasma cutter humming, its energy cell dangerously low. The shuffling of the puppets was getting closer, their numbers growing. They were a tide of broken bodies, crawling and clawing their way through the wreckage, drawn by the entity's singular command to stop them. "Hurry up, Kalen," Anya said, her voice unnervingly calm. "Company's here." He finally found a viable power line. With a surge of redirected energy, the control panel flickered to life. He initiated the sequence, and with a deep, grinding groan that echoed through the entire shaft, the massive locking bolts began to retract. It was agonizingly slow. Behind them, the first of the puppets reached the platform. Anya met them, a whirlwind of focused, deadly energy. But there were too many. For every one she cut down, 2 more crawled over its remains. One of them, a small, lithe figure that had once been a teenage girl, scrambled up a pile of debris and launched itself at Anya's back. Kalen saw it happen. He screamed a warning, but it was too late. The puppet latched on, its teeth sinking into the reinforced fabric of Anya's suit at the shoulder joint. Alarms blared in her helmet as the suit's integrity was breached. Anya roared in pain and fury, throwing the creature off. But the damage was done. A stream of her suit's precious oxygen vented into the toxic air with a loud hiss. At that moment, the final bolt retracted. The massive vent door, freed from its ancient prison, began to slide open, revealing a vertical tunnel of absolute, starless black. The pressure differential between the dying city and the near vacuum of the vent created a monstrous wind, a hurricane that began to suck everything loose into the tunnel. The puppets, caught in the gale, were torn from their feet and flung into the abyss. Kalen grabbed onto the frame of the door, the wind threatening to rip him from his hold. He looked back and saw Anya on her knees, her hand pressed against the rupture in her suit, the plasma cutter lying a few feet away. Her oxygen reserves were plummeting. She wasn't going to make it. He scrambled back to her against the howling wind. "Anya," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar. She looked up at him, her face behind the helmet's visor pale and determined. She shook her head. "Go." "Kalen," her voice crackled in his headset. "Get out. Tell them what happened here. Don't let them forget." "I'm not leaving you," he screamed, trying to pull her to her feet. She pushed him away with surprising strength. "You are. This was always a one-way trip for me. Analyst. I break things. I don't get to see what grows in their place. That's your job now, with a final, desperate act." She unclipped something from her belt and shoved it into his hands. It was the data slate containing all of his original research, all the proof of the spore's existence. "Now go," she commanded, her voice the last order she would ever give. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his world collapsing around him. Then he turned and launched himself into the black maw of the exhaust vent. The last thing he saw was Anya, framed in the shrinking opening of the door, raising her plasma cutter one last time as the last of the puppets crawled towards her. Then the door sealed, and she was gone. The journey up the vent was a violent, chaotic birth. He was tumbled through the darkness, the roar of the escaping atmosphere, his only companion. He slammed into the sides of the tunnel, his suit taking a brutal beating. But it held. He had no sense of time, only the feeling of ascent. Then, with a final, explosive burst, he was ejected from the city and flung out onto the surface of Titan. The shock was absolute. The silence was the first thing that hit him. A silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The sky was a swirling, orange-brown haze, and in the distance, the pale, majestic rings of Saturn were a serene, indifferent backdrop to his agony. The temperature was 180 degrees below zero. His suit's thermal regulators screamed, working overtime to keep him from freezing solid. He got to his feet, a tiny, fragile figure in a vast alien landscape. He looked back at Ethelberg from the outside. There was no sign of the chaos within. It was still a gleaming, perfect city, a testament to human ingenuity. But he knew it was a lie. It was a beautiful, glittering coffin. He had escaped, but his victory felt like ash in his mouth. He was alone, marooned on a frozen moon 1 billion miles from a home he could never return to, with the knowledge that he had left a nascent, angry god to fester in the minds of 1 million sleeping souls. His suit's proximity sensor beeped. 40 meters away, half buried in the frozen nitrogen snow, was a small, automated emergency beacon, likely left over from the city's construction phase. Its solar panels were cracked, but it still held a residual charge. He stumbled towards it, his movements stiff and clumsy in the crushing pressure. He had one chance, one message to send. He knelt before the beacon, plugging Anya's data slate into its archaic interface. He had just enough power for a single, compressed data burst, aimed at the distant, hopeful blue dot of Earth. As he initiated the transmission, a final message for a world that had no idea what was coming, he looked back at the silent city. He had studied decay his entire life, but now he understood. Decay wasn't an end. It was a transformation. And Ethelberg was not the last chapter of humanity's story. It was the first, terrifying verse of a new one. His message was a warning, a plea, and a prophecy. He was the last survivor of a perfect world, and his final act was to tell the universe that the price of paradise was the human soul. The beacon flashed once, a tiny spark of defiance against the overwhelming darkness. Then, its power died, and Kalen, the last citizen of Ethelberg, sat down in the snow to wait for the cold to take him. His duty finally, horribly, done.